Well, it's great to have you all here for this disruptive dialogue in climate adaptive agriculture. We have a terrific panel for you today. So on the far left, please wave. We have John Corbett from AWARE. We have Dirk Vandenhertz from Lemnitech. Wave. and we have Jonah Kolb.
By process of elimination.
Right. So I'll tell you how we're going to do things. We're going to try to not be incredibly boring. We have a good, somewhat controversial topic, at least if you're the Koch brothers or one of the 17 morons running for the GOP nomination. Oh, crap, I'm in Missouri. So 16, you're right, my governor dropped out. Thank God, ex-governor, good riddance. So we're going to start with each of the three panelists profiling themselves and their company for just a few minutes. Then we're going to walk through some questions about this topic, which is essentially adapting to climate change, how farmers are doing it, how data is playing a central role in that. And then, God willing, we're going to have enough time to ask questions, to open up the discussion to all of you. And I don't mean like 3 questions at the end. I'm going to try to leave a 15 or 20-minute block so we can have a real open dialogue here. So, John, why don't you get started?
So good morning, my name is John Corbett. I'm an agricultural climatologist, so this topic falls into something I've spent my life doing. I'm a co-founder and CEO of a company called AWARE. We do agricultural intelligence really across the ag value chain, and what we mean by this is agronomic weather. And across the ag value chain, we're focused on the farmer, but when you think about providing recommendations and agronomically specific kind of suggestions, if you will, at the field level, the aggregation of that information is quite useful for the input providers, which seed types, what crop protection is necessary. I come from the CGIAR, so really my first research efforts in this space had to do with influencing research, really what the research priorities were. And then of course what we've learned is at the farm gate, the buyers, the supply chain managers, and even the commodity risk managers need the aggregation of that same on-farm agronomic weather. Now what we've constructed over the last 15 years is a global database of localized, observed, and 192-hour downscale forecasts. So this is the very specific information we make available globally. It's all available through like an API. But where things get really interesting is when you talk about what's happening to the weather. The Earth's atmosphere weighs about 5.5 quadrillion tons. It's just a big heat engine, right? Poles are still cold, the tropics are warm. You add a degree of heat. It's megajoules that you can't count. And there is so much energy in the atmosphere that what we're seeing is a tripling of the variance. This is where agriculture gets impacted by what we think of as climate adaptive or climate. What happens with agriculture, all it really wants is 80 to 150 days of no extremes. And of course, the statistics are showing now that what's happening with variability is you're gaining these events. Well, the events impact ag very significantly because if even one happens, and thus the risk is the combination of this percent increase and the cost of the consequence. This is really important because the cost of the consequence to food security or supply chain management is huge. So taking it again one little bit further, weather data maps what's actually happening on the land. So I believe, and this will be part of our discussion across the ag value chain, you need data and information to be symmetrical and specific so that the input providers, crop protection in particular, because one of the things about warming is if you warm up the nighttime temperatures a little bit, you're falling into the conditions conducive for bacterial, fungal, and viral foliar diseases. So farmers are experiencing intensity that they've never experienced before, and the input providers don't have the solutions. So as you can imagine, the information tail going all the way back to a manufacturer has got to be there. Even seed types are moving. And then the final comment I'll make about what we do, we monitor the Earth's weather. So from a food security perspective or some of the commodities we're starting to talk about, but we're focused on the farmer. These are things that are in our lens. This variability is impacting and will impact us. It'll impact our children's world in ways that will surprise you. And thus they talk about the fat tail of the risk, meaning things that you've never seen before. I don't know if those of you, my final comment, I don't know if those of you are aware, but I think a week ago there was a stunning picture of the Pacific, and it wasn't the El Nino. What was it? There were 3 hurricanes simultaneously across the Pacific. This has never happened in any recorded history that we know. This is just the manifestation of that extra energy. So that extra energy is variable, and ag needs better information.
Great. Dirk?
Okay, so my name is Dirk Vandenhutz. I'm CEO and founder of a company called Lemnitech. We are based in Germany, and we founded that company 17 years ago with the idea of connecting camera sensors, computers, software, and hardware to analyze biological objects, let's call it this way. We started with small plants in a lab scale, and at a point in our development, we found out that breeders need to have very precise data of their plants, because that's when, in the breeding process, there's a kind of bottleneck. If you proceed data and plants through the breeding process, you need to somehow track them. So what we develop is a phenotyping platform which identifies plants in different wavelengths and provide breeders data. All kind of data, from the visible light to hyperspectrometry, chlorophyll fluorescence, the whole spectrum of visible light. And we started in the lab. We moved with our development into the greenhouse. We're currently providing those systems into the field. And we're hoping that at some time we can develop the sensors small enough so that they can be used, that the same information flow can be used also for farmers directly. So currently we are at the stage where our sensor box, when we move it over the field, weighs roughly about 2.5 tons. But I think we can scale that down. Looking back in history, when we started, our first system was a sensor system which has the enormous amount of pixels of, 160 by 300 pixels, black and white, and that was the most expensive digital camera you could buy at the time. I'm pretty sure all your iPhones have millions of more pixels now. So you could see that the development in sensors is quite fast and moving forward. And the idea is those phenotypic data from plants are important for both for breeders and also for farmers. And the final aim is to provide those data for both farmers and breeders, to allow them to understand plant growth better and grow their plants better, or to breed their plants better.
Great. Good morning. Jonah Kolb. I'm a vice president and partner with Moore & Warner Farm Management. We're based in central Illinois. We have a 160-year and sixth-generation ag legacy, managing and owning farmland assets throughout the Midwest and Great Plains. So today we manage client land. We acquire and manage farmland for institutions, family offices, private investors. We also do consulting, and we do consulting work for startups, ag tech companies, and the investment community, so venture capital, private equity, and hedge funds. Those consulting clients have a need to get their hands and their heads wrapped around production agriculture, the ag economy, on-farm dynamics, and that's where we help. Our team has a mix of farming, farm management, ag lending, business, and finance backgrounds, and we sit at that nexus between the farmers with whom we work and the folks that are looking into ag from the outside and want somebody to help translate the message that's coming from out of the field. Our approach and our philosophy from a stewardship standpoint is to be very heavily involved on farm. So we're making seed selection, fertilization, tillage, crop protection decisions alongside our operators. We are helping them understand new technological advances, encouraging certain technology adoption. We're also learning from the earlier adopters within our portfolio and then taking those technologies and those practices across the rest of our portfolio. One of the things that sets us apart a little bit is that tenure of ag legacy and history that we have. C.H. Moore, the namesake of our company, started investing in ag holdings in the 1830s and 40s. So we have a really long history and a very long-term, multi-generational view. And so as we think about climate change, we work with clients who are centennial farm owners. Their families have owned farms for 100 plus years. As we think about climate change, long-term trends matter because in many cases they have no expectation of selling for the next 100 years. And so what does that mean from a technological standpoint? What does that mean from a farmland asset standpoint? These are things we think about. We don't always have the right answers, but they make for an interesting day-to-day in our office.
Well, when I was chatting with these three gentlemen before we started the panel, I wanted to check if we had any climate change deniers amongst the group up here, because it would obviously make things much more interesting. Alas, common sense is prevailing, but I'm going to turn things over to you guys for 1 second. How many climate change skeptics do we have in the room? 1, 2. Keep them up, be brave. 3. I'm sure it's more than that. I just probably have berated people enough already in the first few minutes. So we're going to talk about first the broad issue of climate change as it impacts agriculture, and then dive into it. So guys, feel free to jump in. How do you think climate change is going to play out in an agricultural sense over the next 10 years, and let's say over the next 20? I don't want to talk 50 or 100, because let's try to keep it focused on what we're immediately grappling with. And which farmers do you think are going to be most impacted, and how bad do you think the impacts are going to be?
Would you like me to start, Mark?
You are the meteorologist.
So I'll answer or address the last comment he made there. The most vulnerable farmers, without a doubt, are anyone on the semi-arid fringe that lacks infrastructure for water. I mean, that's blunt. I mean, the hydrobio earlier talked about the Ogallala, the need for irrigation and infrastructure. I mean, India has an enormous amount of irrigated lands. I think the infrastructure there and the water table are stressed, so water is going to be a huge issue. But your semi-arid lands, which are already the most variable, are going to get even more variable. But then I want to point out something. I gave a talk at the USDA's Ag Forum in February, and the state of Iowa's climatologist had a map, a chart presented by one of the earlier one in my group. They have 120 years roughly in Iowa of really good weather data. The last 5 years, spring and summer rainfalls have fallen outside the 95th percentile. So just keep that in mind. I have the chart, I'm happy to share it. The variability impacts everywhere. It's just some places are obviously going to be able to cope with it because they have deep soils, and the variability is around a really perfect. But on areas that start to get outside that, I would suggest that the vulnerable are the semi-arid fringe, and it's going to get worse, and an awful lot of humanity lives there. So,
from our perspective, from a Midwest row crop farmer perspective, our view is that, yes, there are going to be changes. Dealing with variability is going to be the biggest one. We're probably in a better position relative to the global population to handle it. But we think about over that 20-year time frame, kind of 3 elements that we have to deal with. 2 are volatility related. So the first is essentially market price volatility. We see more movement more rapidly in grain markets than for many farmers over the first half or first 3 quarters of their careers. And so managing that market, that price risk, is a risk management, financial management component. There is the in-field variability of how do we deal with more extreme weather events. That's an agronomic and field operation volatility issue, and that comes down to how good are our predictions, what are the tools that we have to deal with increased foliar diseases because we're having increased temperatures. That comes down to using data around prediction, data around management, but also do we actually have the tools, the genetics, the crop input tools to actually manage the in-field operations. That's really a growing issue. And then from an industry perspective in the Midwest, the 20-year question that we have is, what's the crop mix of the future, right? Do we move away from the corn and soybean complex? How important is it that we're working other crops into that rotation? As I think about decades out, do we move away from this 2-crop monocrop cultivation model? Do we move to a point where we're using autonomous tractors and autonomous field equipment that allows us to multi-crop a system that is more resilient to the variation that we're seeing in the weather. That's a much longer term. We're not seeing as much development there, but that's something that we wonder about
those things take time to build
Those things take time, but we think that may be where we're headed over a decades-long time period.
Interesting. So the other thing that we're supposed to talk about in this session is this explosion, because it's so closely linked to this discussion on climate, this explosion of on-farm data. Right? I remember coming to this event a couple years ago, and it was a much more life sciences-oriented affair. And I think everyone who's been in the agricultural space over the course of the last decade has seen the rise of the machines and software eating the world. Right? And all of a sudden, you can't swing a stick at these conferences without hitting a programmer, whatever term you want to use for them. And so, at the same time, when I speak to people who are ag tech VCs like myself, the words farmer fatigue are starting to be bandied about, because all of a sudden, whereas you had people used to dealing with a few large companies, now they're getting hit up by 100 or 200 small companies that they'd never heard of that all want to do pilots and test stuff out, and there's more choice than ever. It's like going into a supermarket or Whole Foods, and so I think the question is, what do you really see on farm? And Joan, I'm very interested in your perspective in this on this specifically because of the vantage point that you have overseeing a variety of farms. But what do you see actually being adopted on farm in terms of this new arsenal of technologies? And where is there hype that is vastly exceeding the actual on-the-ground transformation?
Sure.
Right? Feel free, all three of you can chime in, but I want to start with Jonah on this one.
And I think the idea of farmer fatigue is absolutely right. We in our business have a variety of firms come through that are looking for insight. They want to do beta testing with us. They want to do a pilot program. We support ag innovation. It's important. It's important to our business. It's important to our clients. But at the end of the day, what I think a lot of firms fail to realize is that the return on time for us is generally terrible. Because we're helping someone come up a learning curve, and in our consulting business, we get paid for it, but on you get our free product for 3 months or a growing season, it's not that interesting. So what is being adopted? I would say probably the best traction that we've seen, to name names, is precision planting. And part of the obviously Monsanto acquired it recently. Precision planting gained traction because it's a combination of software and equipment, and it was providing a better tactile feel for in combine and planter monitors that weren't doing a great job or weren't necessarily doing the job that they could have.
And it was a retrofit.
And it's a retrofit, exactly. Right. It's not a whole new system. It's relatively easy from a plug-and-play standpoint. You get a monitor. It's kind of interesting. You get better data. It worked. Some of the other things that we've seen gain traction, obviously climate is probably the most widely tried data product. And I say widely tried, I'm not sure I would say widely adopted at this point. Every farmer that we work with has tried Climate Basic. Some have opted for Climate Pro. There's been a lot of challenge around pricing. But then there's this real challenge within the farmer community. If you can roll out a product, it generally needs to work. You're going to try it for a season, and if it stumbles, you're probably not going to be excited about trying it the next season. And this is something where ag is different than other areas of tech, at least for row crop, right?
So you're saying Climate Pro doesn't work?
I am saying there are some aspects of the product that need further development, but if you talk to enough, if you talk to enough farmers, they will generally say, "I'm happy to use it for free," or at this trial pricing, charge me $3 an acre, and there's no way, especially in this tight margin environment, that I'm going to open my wallet for this product that I'm not sure I can use. There's also right, all farmers are not the same, depends on the size of operation and all these other pieces. But part of it is that if you're going to roll out a product and you're going to roll it out in a big way, we're so used to being sold snake oil that it really has to work because the innovation cycle and the adoption cycle is slower if you're on a one growing season per year basis. And that gets lost. I know there are other parts of your question, but I'll stop
No,
there.
that was great. I couldn't have asked for a better response.
But I'm also leaving off a whole slew of other companies that are doing interesting things. And one of the challenges on farm is a lack of appreciation for how data products are differentiated. And so there's a weather product. That is different than granular or conservice, which is, we think of it more as an ERP, which is a record-keeping and a financial management product.
If I can pause you for 1 second just to extract 2 more companies out of you,
Yep.
and not just beating up on the giant next door.
Sure.
Literally next door.
I'm not beating up on
So 2 other companies that you see getting a lot of actual data companies getting a lot of traction.
Farmers Business Network,
Okay.
because it has a slick UI, $500 a year. It's easy for guys to try. They get it. And then Granular and Conservice, I think, are doing, they're both competing in the same market, but are gaining traction for operators above a certain size, just given the nature of that product offering.
Cool. Okay. Do you want to chime in on this one?
Well, I come from the science side, and the data we provided are definitely now at the point not something farmers can use. But what I can see when we hear that the extremes are getting higher, that we don't only need better crops for, in certain areas, but for certain small compartments of that. So I think in the future, farmers will have crops which have been specifically breeded for this area, a small part of it. So that they don't need to use the technology during the growth season to track that, but getting seed stuff sent to them that they can grow anyway, in linked with those climate data. So I fully agree that the technologies need to be much better and easier to use. I mean, it's when we start from the science, we hear that a lot, that our data is too complex to understand.
Now, John, you guys are more emerging markets focused or more
Well, no,
developed
I
markets?
was going to take the angle just to move away from row crops, because
Right.
we clearly are in the U.S., there's no question there.
Okay.
My background, I come really from working in Africa a fair bit. We lived in Kenya for about 5 years. I would like to point out the farmer fatigue there means something very different, and it's not an influx of too many companies. Trust me, using a djembe, a hoe, over a couple of acres will definitely wear you out. But I will then say that the data explosion, and certainly agronomic weather like what we're doing, this is desperately needed, because as this weather variability increases, particularly the rainy season changes, the shifts, these smallholder farmers, and I will remind you that although here in the United States and in Europe and parts of Brazil there are very giant farms, the majority of farms on Earth, as we saw in one of the presentations, Mark, yesterday, we're talking 1 and 2 hectares. So we're talking 580 million farmers. This is what the FAO statistics show, of which about 1% are addressed in this market here. The rest feed the rest of the world and are actually crucially important for, you could call it even human security. So I would say that the delivery through an SMS to a farmer in Ghana, which is what we're doing now, we have 17,000 farmers receiving our data across Ghana through a partner. It's changing their world. They have never had a weather forecast. So the tropical forecasts are difficult. They're not always accurate. They're not always accurate anywhere. But as you can imagine, if it's the first time you've ever seen a forecast, getting it right puts us on the literally demigod status. Getting it wrong is like, oh, it's just another one of those, wealthy company coming down, dropping stuff on us. So there's a real interesting, different tech adoption challenge, but it's one that I believe is imperative, because once again, you're in a data scarce area. This is one reason for our, if you will, the rich nature of our resources. We came from a place where there was so little data that we had to build all kinds of things, and then you come to a place where there's a lot more observed data, it works even better. The point being, these smallholder farmers are our future in many, many ways, because they will impact the markets, the pricing, and definitely the humanitarian side of the way we live. And in a connected world, you're not about ready to tolerate pictures of, I remember from UNICEF days, starving children in Ethiopia. I mean, literally these very troubling photographs. That's not going to work anymore. We're going to have to figure out ways to move these products to smallholder farmers in places that don't have roads. And trust me, drones, by the way, I've seen it in Papua New Guinea, delivering medicine. Okay, so this is an interesting use of a technology, right? Okay, but information, that cell phone, that's probably the most influential piece of technology humans have ever created, okay? More than a computer. You know why? Because it's in the hands of a couple of billion people. Okay, nothing else has ever disseminated that fast. So there's opportunities here to make a difference.
Yep. So I guess the next question that I would ask is, do you see farmers that you interact with beginning to make adaptations in their agronomic practices, in their cropping patterns, in either response to or anticipation of climate change? Is that something that you're seeing? Or is that still kind of, we throw out these numbers, 9 billion people to feed, the world's going to starve to death, all of this stuff, and is that still a horizon away? You want to start?
Sure. I would say we see the response to market and weather volatility. The response to a longer-term trend is so dependent for row crop farmers on developments in other areas that they don't necessarily have control over, around plant breeding for drought-resistant hybrids, around the development of new farm equipment that allows multi-cropping systems. So I would say not a lot of response on the long-term climate trend, but around dealing with volatility, absolutely.
So do you see, a simple example, do you see purchase of drought-resistant seeds? Do you see new irrigation systems being bought? Do you,
Sure. So
when it comes to the CapEx and the OpEx?
On the CapEx, absolutely. Continuing to think about, and this is a good example this year where through a lot of the Midwest, a lot of very early rain, if weather events are increasing in their volatility, getting water away is a big problem for dryland farming throughout much of the Midwest. And thinking about how we deal with that water means there's more CapEx going into pattern tiling and drainage, for example. So that's one way. And then some of these data products are another, especially around managing your marketing and your grain price risk is another area where it's not as much a CapEx as it may be an incremental change in how you're managing your grain book.
John, you want to build on any of the comments you made?
I would
Actual changes in
something that came
practice.
up. I was on a panel at Colorado State University this spring at an ag summit, and this idea of climate adaptive is great. I mean, there's even something called climate smart ag. If you Google that, there's tons and tons of literature on it. Unfortunately, in my book, what we actually need are, and it's an information driven because it exists in our other supply chains, we need weather agile agriculture. We need the capacity for farmers to have the ability to respond to a foliar disease outbreak, or the ability, we have it in the US, I mean, because the infrastructure is there, but most of the world doesn't do this. You get a late spring, something where May stays really cold or farmers can't get in the field. I mean, the seed companies will come back and swap out the longer season seed for a shorter mid-out seed because they know that there's not enough heat units to produce that. So that system's working. Most of the world, though, doesn't have access to that sort of agile input. And I think one of the real points about this is climate, and maybe I'm splitting a hair that's not so important to most people. Climate to me is this, is the longer term piece of what you're planning for. Weather is what farmers have to deal with. And oddly enough, you need a weather agile information schema so that you know not only whether there are drought tolerant seeds available, but shorter season seeds. I mean, things that allow you to adapt to what is happening now. And then of course the fertilizer and the crop protection inputs are critically important. And then of course that same information is going to be critically important to the guy who has a chicken broiler farm because he needs to feed his chickens. He has to know that he can buy that within some distance, because if he gets too far away, it gets really expensive, which then makes food more expensive. So I think you have a lot of challenges with increased variability, whether you're a large commercial farm worrying about both drainage and drought, or you're a smallholder farmer who's worried about just being able to protect there and use fertilizer optimally in a sort of an eco-optimization model, which is if the rains are good and the soil has enough moisture, now I want to take the risk of fertilizing because I'll get return on that fertilizer input. I mean, it's not a problem of too much fertilizer. I guess my point being is climate adaptive is imperative, and I would emphasize more the weather agile.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think in India we've seen that where there are strategies that are being developed for essentially the scenario of a failed monsoon, where it's like, okay, it's going to be painful, but we shift towards pulses, right, as opposed to cotton and shorter duration and all of this. Obviously there's this tension between the technologies required for short-term agility and the technologies required for actual long-term climate adaptation. Do you see the development of the latter, or do you see that hitting the the thinking of farmers, or penetrating the consciousness of the discussions in this area, kind of where we need to go. Jonah, do you see that at all? Do you see?
I think most of what we see around managing volatility is continuing to diversify your operation. So if you're a decent-sized row crop farmer, maybe you have added an insurance company, maybe you've built your own grain complex. You're extending or you're diversifying your risk a little bit beyond just growing the field crop.
Right.
But in terms of, are you planning for the climate change 20 years out? Not yet, I would say, is by and large.
Do you see any shift, and this is a general question, do you, kind of reflecting the fact that we're in a society that is seeming to to shift towards more consumption of fresh produce, less consumption of grain? Obviously, certain categories like orange juice are in free fall, right? Do you see in the Midwest, in large-scale farming, in this kind of monoculture region, do you see anything moving in that direction?
On a selective basis, you'll have a farming family that has decided we're going to go into some higher value-added product to diversify our risk. But generally speaking, if you think about the infrastructure that is set up, we just don't have the infrastructure, the human capital.
Corn, soy, wheat infrastructure.
And if you get into certain vegetable products, for example, we don't have the labor base to do it in any effective or efficient way. And I get this question from folks that I've been to school with that live on the coast, and it's, why aren't you doing a CSA? And it's because
I love those questions.
There's no scale. This isn't what we do. We grow grain very cheaply, and it feeds the world, and it goes into the protein complex, and there is value in that, and that's what we do really well, and we do it at scale. So on the margins,
the most compelling thing I've seen here is the idea of horticulture substituting out cotton in the Southeast.
I think that's probably the best.
Right,
example.
that's like kind of a macro possibility that you could talk about.
Or to the extent that you control enough land or you're a large enough operation that you can diversify into specialty products where you're doing it on a contract basis, right? So you have a CPG company that needs to feed their mill with whatever specialty product that they can't normally gain supply for. If you're able to figure out how to grow that, you have the equipment, you go through the brain damage, that can be lucrative and diversifying, but it's not taking a cornfield and suddenly growing organic pumpkins.
Understood. Dirk?
Well, what we see is, from our research side again, is, for example, in Germany, the area where I come from, there's a lot of sugar beet growing. And we see the problem that we're getting fungus coming from the south. It just made it over the Alps now. And it's about 5 years away from the area where all the big sugar beet farms are. So now there is a rush in between the research to get the right varieties in the ground and protect it against fungus disease and stuff like that. So the data we're talking about here has also a timeline added to that, and I think that's very important. As you mentioned, we're seeing big varieties, and the changes are getting faster. So I think that the whole issue we're talking about here is that the data we are getting from all different ways need to be included in the breeding and in the farming process faster. Otherwise, we will lose big parts of our production area, and the question is, can we recover them anymore in the future? So
hold that thought, because I'm going to ask you that next.
That's an information to remember.
Yeah. Any thoughts on this, John?
My only comment was, and I don't remember who told me, but someone in the Canadian they told the story was this last season they grew soybeans farther north than ever before, and their problem wasn't that it didn't produce well, it's they didn't have the infrastructure to kind of harvest it and sell it well. And my point being is that things are moving, and you have to have that infrastructure to make that profit, and it's not easy to shift from grain to a vegetable. You just can't do that in the sense that you can't be profitable. So it's bringing changes, but people are trying and paying attention to things. I mean, growing the story of the soybeans farther north into Canada is fascinating just because look at what's happening, and that's the other side of this variability and the warmth.
Yeah. So this, there's an interesting question here about data for breeding, data for agronomy, and climate data, and just having more of it than ever before. Dirk, you guys are in an interesting are in an interesting space where you are generating a huge amount of data for the breeding process. How do you see that linking up with the other data streams that are being created, and how do we start getting a virtuous cycle now that you do have interconnectivity, or we're beginning to get towards points of interconnectivity, to advance breeding based on all these new data streams that are coming out from the field?
So when we look at the big ag companies, when they do breeding programs, they may have like 10 million plots all over the world, which sounds a lot. But in the end, this is just less than 1% of all the possible plots they can do if they would receive the data from the farmers. So what I think is we currently have two data sets in that world. There is the breeding companies which produce the research data. They know everything about the plants. They know how they perform under drought stress, salt stress, whatever. They can make them fungus, disease resistant, whatever. And then there is the farming world, which has all the climate data, and they know what they're getting out of the field. But for both sides, it seems to be very hard to link those data. There is approaches to do that, lots of approaches, but the data sets seem to be too diverse to really do that on an online way. So what we are trying to achieve here is a unique way of communication between every farmer information, every research information, which goes back to a centralized information system where people can use that in both directions. Again, to improve their crops on the breeding program, but also to understand, okay, if I have a late season, what are my chances? What can I do? What are my options and still have a good harvest? Do I change the crop? Do I change the seeds? All of that. That information is theoretically available, but as we heard, it's not available for the farmers. They can't understand it, and the researchers seem to have not fully access to the farm information. And this is somehow, we come really from the research, and the bigger our systems are getting and the more data we're providing, we're shifting into the way that this is a real world approach, that we see the same data as the farmers are seeing. So, and we are hoping to get platforms and communication systems to get these data in both directions.
Jonah, do you see anything like, I imagine a lot of the farmers you support are working in partnership with Pioneer, with Monsanto. Mm-hmm. Do you see anything like this actually kind of happening?
One of the challenges that I've been surprised about in the last 2 years is that we haven't seen more work done around data sharing, ownership, restrictions on use, because it exists, but to what extent is a farmer willing to open up and share his data? Right now it's going to a cloud here, it's going to a cloud over there. He knows it's in the cloud, he has no idea where it is or what it means, doesn't know who it's being shared with. And so
we have clouds everywhere but in the sky.
Right. And so, yes, some of that is getting back into the companies that need it from a development standpoint, but as a practical matter, all the operators that we work with realize I have a real world lab right here. And you also have this competing message from industry, and it's use these data products that are truly big data driven, right? We're talking massive data sets. You need real data scientists. So, we want you to pay for this new product over here, but my local seed rep is still sending you insignificant trial plot data from the 50 acres in this part of your county. And it's depending on how well you understand probability and research, you realize that you're being fed two totally different messages. And to a certain extent, which way do we want to go? And how do we actually increase, when we get down to questions around how do farmers receive and make decisions, how do we increase the base level of understanding of the use of statistics with farm data? So probabilistic decision making is something that is done on every farm. It's probably not described the same way by most operators as by an academic or a finance person. But how do we actually increase the amount of probabilistic decision making so that if the recommendation is use product A, and you don't get the result that you want, you realize that it wasn't that the recommendation failed, it's that it's a 75% recommendation, right? And we're just not there yet.
And I think, I mean, if you were the one who mentioned FBN, right? Farmers Business Network. I think that's kind of like their secret sauce, which is charge nothing for the product, right? But demand the data.
Right.
And then you can start building towards these better and better probabilistic recommendations.
Right. And that's the hope. But at the same time, around data ownership and privacy, there is this, the savvier operator says $500 a year for my entire operation does not make you a promising venture-backed company. Where is the money going to be made? Farmers are a savvy group and want to realize the value of the on-farm data and make sure that, in the history of ag, unfortunately, a lot of what's happened is for every dollar in value that's created by innovation, relatively small fraction of that goes back to the farmer, and other people in the supply chain capture it. And so if I'm thinking about opening up all of my farm data, I'm providing value to other people that I want to innovate, but how much of that value am I going to realize? And that's a real concern.
Well, last question to you guys, and then we're going to turn things over to the audience. What do you think it's going to take to really push farmers to take steps towards climate adaptation? Do you think, when is the tipping point going to be reached? Right, and are we going to plan for it in time, or is it going to kind of descend upon us and we're going to have a couple of horrible years and then the change will come?
Well, that would be my thunder. I mean,
Right.
When you get impacted by something that was unexpected or a fat tail event or something that's never, northwestern Ohio had more rain this summer than ever, right?
The flooding of a large American city.
And
didn't
all of a
seem to do
sudden,
it.
I think people are willing to listen because it's a financial decision. And I think the whole idea is learn from these event-based things, whether it's a drought that develops over time or a huge amount of rainfall that falls, and understand that this is going to be kind of a new normal. And I think people are already taking, that's why this dialogue is happening. And the idea of being more diversified, these are things that are inherent. And people who live on the land, come on, we pay attention to that stuff, and that's exactly what they are doing. So I don't think it's a mystery at all that the idea of some diversification is smart, because if you put all your eggs, to use that expression, in one spot, all it takes is one event and you lose everything. So you would start to diversify. I don't know how else to say what that's going to look like, though, in 5 or 10 years. So.
Sure.
Well, I think as the farmers are very clever. I mean, they see that they need to change the way they run their farm. So what I think will happen is that the seed companies will provide specific seeds for specific areas, and that will allow them to really stay in the market. But yeah, big events will happen. We see that the farmers are threatened around the infection of sugar beet, and they have to change. And it's a whole industry. It's not only that they say, oh, okay, we're going to shift now to corn because they have all the sugar mills there and everything. That's a value per se. And so I think it would be more clever to provide them crops which they still can grow. So new varieties of sugar beet, so that they can stay in the business without changing all the infrastructure.
And finally, Jonah.
For the row crop producers that we work with, I think it'll be a slightly slower process, just because well-capitalized, they're sitting in a good position, have a lot of industry supporting it. They're in a better position relative to the global farmer to weather risk. I do think the two things that will change adoption, especially of more ag tech, will be better proof of the return on investment. In too many cases, it's a promise, and that's about it.
Sure.
And then the other piece is actually a little bit of a shakeout. And this comes a bit from Moore and Warner's long ag legacy and historical time frame. One of the things that we try to convey to new tech companies is that our adopting on a farm as a management company, one of our farmers adopting your product, is going to be a tiny blip in the bucket of a multi-generational farming business. And if we adopt it in year one versus we give you 2 or 3 more years to figure out what you're doing and your competitors to go away, is somewhat irrelevant to us. Maybe we have slightly better years if it's a great product, but if you're talking 150-year farm owning history, I don't necessarily want to be on the bleeding edge because the profit isn't there. Being on the bleeding edge may be a philosophical choice. It's not always an economic choice. And so even in
Sounds like a painful sales cycle.
even in a commodity-driven competitive industry, if your product delivers superior returns, does not mean that all of the privately held ag businesses are going to be forced to adopt it in a short time frame.
Yep. And 15 minutes. So we're going to do questions. Questions end with a question mark. Right? Let's just be clear about that. This is not monologues, it's questions. And we have 15 minutes for it. So let's get started. Ideally, please address the question to one member of the panel, preferably not the moderator. Philippe.
Mark, yeah, thank you. Maybe Jonathan, we've been talking about climate adaptation to address the challenges of climate change. And I don't want to, it's not the intention to get political here, but what about the issue of farming, agricultural production being a source of climate change? Now, I know people will disagree with that thought, but what's out there, what should people be thinking about in the industry?
That's an excellent question, and one that I would say very, very rarely comes up within the ag community. And what should we do about it is essentially the question. I actually think that's something that will, in a certain sense, self-moderate, in that ultimately even commodity grain growers have to respond to consumer demand. And we're seeing that across lots of folks were talking about traceability in the last couple of days. And I think some of those changes, as the causal links are made and as public awareness increases, you're going to see the demand basically just pushed down all the way until you get to the farm gate, or it's
Right.
so
I mean,
profitable.
Purdue Farms just bought Nyman Ranch,
Right.
right?
Right.
The world's getting weird.
But as a practical matter around things like carbon emissions, being more fuel efficient is a profitable choice. And that's already happening.
Yes, ma'am. Oh, sorry. Glare.
One particular, I'm sorry, particular example, but there's a lot of interest in the consumer public on buy fresh, buy local. There's a major, I mean, I'm seeing this all across the country, that people want to get their food locally, they want it fresh, they don't want it brought in from long distances. And I'm curious what interface there is between that consumer preference and what you see as climate adaptation to climate, whether one is going to affect the other or what.
Who's the-
certainly an important movement in agriculture.
Who's the question for?
I'm sorry,
Which panelist is the question for?
Anybody?
I'm not.
Okay, anyone who wants to respond.
I'm happy to say that I'll respond in brief, is to say I just came from I visited a giant veg farm in Southern California, and they notice the desire for local farming in their sales to like East Coast and Montreal, but only during August and September, because that's the only time of year where someone can grow something locally to feed a population living in a city. So fundamentally, there's the connection is there, that consumers want this, and some of the greenhouse, some of the higher end food shops, some of the vertical farming we've seen will provide some food. And I don't know the calculation relative to how many vegetables you can produce in a warehouse relative to a city's consumption needs. But the seasonality of agriculture and frankly just the cold, warm seasons and et cetera will, I don't think ever, I don't know, I don't see that changing much. I see some elite, some very specific products coming into the market, very local, and in different environments, there's more of it. But I think in a lot of places, I mean, I did my graduate work in Minneapolis, and I guarantee you there's only one very short growing season. And, and then what happens is you have a giant carbon footprint you can associate with the shipment of goods, but you would have a giant carbon footprint trying to heat a greenhouse. So you have choices to make. So I think it's a very good and relevant question. But if we demand variety in our diets, my guess is that this infrastructure delivering things from southern climates to northern climates and so forth will continue into the future. That it's not a, I don't know that it's a big thing. It's specific opportunities, but I don't know how big it is.
I'm going to jump in on that just very briefly.
cool.
It's not an issue that we deal with on a daily basis. It's one that I care about personally. And when we talk about local food, what I really wish we would narrow and nail down is, what is the consumer actually interested in? Is it because they want to know the farmer? Is it because they care about the carbon footprint? Is it because they care about labor relations? And ultimately, in vast parts of the country, your local food has a much worse carbon footprint and is very inefficient, and the farmers that are able to produce it don't have a reasonable standard of living or are subsidizing their production through whether it's government programs or personal investment. It's not always what a consumer thinks it is. And I think there are great reasons to have local production for freshness, quality, for knowing your farmer, for diversity of local economies. But right now, they tend to be, it's mixed in with it being perceived as being more globally sustainable. And that's really not always the case, but we haven't reached the level of dialogue right now to be that specific.
Yeah, I think it's fundamentally a freshness and quality thing.
Yeah.
I think people are becoming, their standards of what they consider to be acceptable food have increased. And that's really kind of what it plays out. And I think the other stuff is probably lies they tell themselves. But
Mark, one last
They
comment
have
on
that picture of the nice farmers, you know, and then
That's right.
when they see it when it comes to their town, they say, well, no, not that near. It's too noisy, too smelly.
right. Yeah, you had your hand up.
Yes, do you see a shift or an interest in shift from annual crops that are, release a lot of carbon into the atmosphere, create a lot of erosion, subsequent issues with the amount of inputs, energy inputs that are required, to perennial crops such as hazelnut, where I know some farmers, large scale, that are looking to start to transition away from corn and soybean to a diverse mix of hazels with intercropping, row cropping of forage crops. Do you see anything like that?
To the extent that questions to me, on a large-scale commercial basis, risk-adjusted return, we're not seeing it very much. It's certainly a strategy. We're seeing it in specific places. I'd say the larger play from a farmland investment standpoint is maybe reallocating from row crop to permanent crops with a geographical move. So selling in the Midwest and buying permanent crops on the coasts, not necessarily taking corn and soybean ground in the Midwest and transforming it to something else. It's certainly happening on a very small selective basis, but the infrastructure, human capital, knowledge isn't there yet to do it on a larger scale, so we don't see it very much.
I can tell you that in India, there has been, for the last decade, a major shift into oil palm cultivation. Now, let's be clear. Oil palm cultivation in India goes over land that used to have annual crops or semi-annual crops like sugarcane or corn or rice, as opposed to being the kind of oil palm that we think of in Indonesia and Malaysia, where you set the world on fire and roast orangutans. So it's actually net afforestation, a carbon sink, and more of what you're kind of talking about with hazelnuts. Though the oil palm, because of Malaysia, Indonesia, has a horrible reputation, but that has definitely been a trend. There's about 250,000 hectares planted at this point, and it's a major zone of growth.
When you asked for climate deniers in the audience, and you had a few hands go up, I wouldn't have expected very many hands go up, but somebody blurted out a very interesting important question that I want John to answer, and that is, yes, I buy there's climate change, but we don't know the cause. Can you address that?
The way I always answer that is, does it really matter if we know the cause? Frankly, the atmosphere is warming and it's having huge impacts on ag and food and humans. Yeah, no, I realize there's a huge political, but that becomes the kind of this can of worms where what is the most appropriate responses? I mean, from my personal perspective, look, we're observing temperature increase and we have observed carbon dioxide increase. And you can deny that 3 is smaller than 4 if you want to, but when you measure things, you have to agree that it is measured and we have a source, and you may not know all the sinks and we can't explain everything yet, but there is clearly something going on that relates to, in my opinion, to the consumption of hydrocarbons, and it's into the atmosphere, and it was predictable. I will then say that I believe the climate models totally underestimate the length of time it's going to take for the change to happen. Nature doesn't do anything slowly or in between. It switches. And that, to me, is just my little personal comment that things are going to change rather rapidly. And when the ice melts and certain things happen, I had a wonderful course at University of Minnesota on geomorphology, glacial geomorphology from a specialist, and he pointed out that if water is moving, it does not matter what the air temperature is, it will melt ice because it has friction. And you put that equation onto Greenland today with the rivers running across that ice will melt. It's not going to go it slow. So.
Did anyone hear about like the giant virus being found in the ice? Yeah, so as things melt,
Things happen.
things that used to be sleeping can wake up. So maybe that'll spur people into action. It's like the beginning, it's like a Michael Crichton novel, right? Only without the space aliens. So other questions? I think we have probably 2 questions, maybe 3. You, sir.
As a reformed commodity trader, my mind goes to closer in. How good is the technology today to predicting these black swan type anomalies, and how good do you think it'll be into the future? Jonathan asked this.
Do you mean like a true seasonal forecast?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to tell you right now, I actually believe it's even going to be more difficult to do a seasonal forecast. Frankly, the amount of energy in the atmosphere is something we've never seen before. Since models are built on something historical and projecting to the future, you've got a problem because you assume stationarity in the signal, and there's none. It's moving. The flip side is we're monitoring weather. I can monitor every coffee field on the planet, and I do already see in Central America, they're dying at the lower elevations because the nights are too warm. It's gone from Haiti. There's going to be changes in some of these commodities that are predictable, but I want to separate that prediction from the prediction of a seasonal forecast. I live in Colorado for a reason, National Center for Atmospheric Research. I spend time there. I've been wanting these guys to build a 6 to 9 month actual forecast to try to do a process-based forecast. And there's a lot of intent, and they need a few $1 million and things like that. It hasn't really happened, but that would be the most important thing, is for us to grasp a little better what seed types we should be putting in the ground. I mean, we know a lot about the genetic capability of that corn seed. We just don't know when and where to put it in the ground necessarily. I think this last year I saw articles about drought in Ohio and these farmers putting drought-tolerant varieties in the ground, and obviously they didn't get any payback for that. And that's the nature of the world today. This variability is huge. So I don't have a lot of insight into whether or not someone will successfully come up with a 3, 6, or 9 month forecast in the near future. They might, but there are really smart people working on that problem.
Last question, you, ma'am, right up there in the front.
Karen Sorber from Accompanying Technologies, and I think this is directed to you, John, but because you mentioned the water issue so much, we're in a water treatment technology. With the ebbs and flows of drought and then flooding, would it be helpful if the farmers had a effective, efficient way to clean the water that floods off for storage when there's drought?
It's the storage that's the problem. Flat areas it's really hard to store water. I mean, it just is, and that's, I think, one of the best ways to comment about adapting to climate change. In the western U.S., where I'm from, all of the areas, we build reservoirs all the time. And so we talk about a drought happening after 3 to 5 years of really dry weather. You go to someplace like UK where they don't store a lot of water, so this addresses your issue. If it doesn't rain for 3 weeks in the summer, they have watering constraints put on immediately because they don't store any water. So the real issue is how do you store water? Water is heavy and corrosive. It moves. It's really difficult. So I don't know how to address your question. It's a real challenge.
And I promised Rohit we would end 2 minutes early, and we have. So thank you all very much. Thank the panel.